having Deanna work with us. I mean, you folks are absolutely so lucky because Deanna, as you know, is a force to be reckoned with, right? Nobody kind of gets to tiptoe around Deanna. When Deanna starts to move things forward, Deanna sometimes calls and asks me the most bizarre things, but when she calls and she asks things, we listen because we know she's got a mission and she's moving forward. So this is also a real tour de force as well. I was real pleased to be able to come out and do this, thanks to Nev, who actually hosted the meeting in Edmonton yesterday, which was a great meeting as well. It was a bit broader because they do acromegaly, Cushing's, and the other pituitary conditions together, and they have this amazing physician who actually hosts the group. So it was a really great opportunity to be able to do that and to come out here, though. So I'm just delighted, and we've always been so pleased in terms of Deanna and her participation in the conferences that we do. Some of you will notice that last year we actually had a national pituitary meeting. And it was the first time we actually, had a real meeting together, trying to bring in people from across the country. And it was a great opportunity as well to kind of have people talk about what was happening in different parts of the country. And I think one of the things that we are very compelled about is the need to have more national groups because there's so much that people can learn from each other. And there are, in fact, so many, I think, advances that are taking place that it's really hard to keep up with it. But also I think, you make a wonderful support. For us, it's really great because CORD really does need to have voices at the national table. So I was asked to talk a little bit about what is CORD. So those of you who may not be aware of our organization, talk a little bit broadly about what are some of the challenges in terms of access to rare disease drugs. I know that, in acromegaly, pituitary, there are not that many new drugs yet, but I think as there are lots that are on the horizon, there's lots that's being developed, and there's a lot more that could be developed under the right circumstances. What are the challenges we have in Canada? And it may surprise you to know, it may not surprise you to know, that Canada actually is one of the slowest countries in terms of the adoption of both rare disease strategies and in terms of drugs for rare diseases. So we do really well as a country in terms of healthcare. We don't really do very well relative to other countries with regard to rare diseases. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are and what we need to do there and why it's important to you. And then also a bit about rare disease groups and advocacy. I was asked to talk a bit about doing advocacy. I don't know how well it would fit in here because you guys are pretty powerful advocates on your own. So it may or may not be anything in here that's going to add anything to what you're already doing, but certainly it's one of the things we try to do. So this is CORD, and we are a network. We do have individual members. We do try to support individuals who may not have a group, but quite frankly, we are a network of patient organizations. Some of the organizations are national. Some of the organizations are, in fact, local, as they may be here. But for us, we really can't support individual patients. I can't do what you folks do. I can't do what Deanna does. We cannot hold these kind of meetings because there are just too many people and there are too many conditions. We have an info line. We have a web line. But really, when people write to us or people call us, we have to be real honest. We cannot help you in terms of your individual, if you've got an individual case. Every once in a while, we do get somebody who we do try to, because of whatever extraordinary circumstance, we really do try to reach out and do something. But as you can imagine, it would take a lot of time. What we need is what you folks are, and that is we need to have patient organizations. We need to have support groups on the ground so that if somebody called us and contacted us, we can send them over to somebody here. So if we learn about somebody or we have a request to us, if they don't have a patient group, it's really challenging. So one of the things we try to do is to encourage and to help support patient groups to develop because it makes it feasible for us to be able to have support for individuals because we really can't do much at a national level in terms of individual patients. We can provide some advice to the groups. We can maybe know some of the experts, but really that's a challenge for us. So really our mandate is really working at a policy level, at a level in terms of encouraging national programs, national mechanisms for diagnosis, national mechanisms in terms of centers of excellence, and certainly national programs in terms of research and drug development and access. But that's the level that we have to work at. So for us, that's where we focus. We love to and we want to support what might be happening at provincial level. So Deanna's talking about for things like, having a proclamation or an awareness day in the province. That is something that we really can support, and we do want to come in and help support, but it's hard for us to do it without having good on-the-ground organizations. So these are the kind of things that we do. We advance policy. I was saying yesterday to the group there, when we talk about policy, I used to always wonder kind of what is policy anyway, right? I mean, you hear the word policy a lot. You kind of go like, my husband actually is a professor in business. He just retired. He taught business policy, and he used to say like, what the heck is policy, sort of. And somebody actually explained it to me in a way that I thought made a lot of sense. It says policy is how you allocate resources. Once you've identified what your policies are and your principles, then you know where to put your money. So that's what we're talking about here. And the challenge we have in Canada is we do not have a rare disease policy. We don't have an orphan drug policy. We have a cancer control policy. We have a mental illness policy. We have a cardiovascular policy. We have a diabetes policy and strategy. We don't have anything for rare diseases. So we don't have any monies that are really allocated in terms of rare diseases. Now we'll talk a little about what it means in terms of why that's important. So I think as Deanna says, there are about 7,000 rare diseases. It could be 7, it could be 8, it could be 6, I'm not exactly sure. Because some of these diseases are big diseases and well known. Muscular dystrophy, cystic fibrosis, some of which people say, my gosh, I didn't know those were rare because I hear about them a lot. But in some respects, they are still very small in numbers. And then there's some that are really, really tiny. Some of the rare diseases are so tiny they may only affect one family. Some of the diseases are so tiny that there are only maybe 10 people in all of Canada that have this disease, or 1,000 people in the world that will have that disease. So, and then some of the diseases are much bigger diseases. Muscular sclerosis is an interesting disease. In the US, it's considered a rare disease because the way they define rare diseases in the rest of the world is not. So that's kind of interesting. So, some of these diseases have become more numerous so that they no longer can be considered to be rare. And some diseases are rare in some parts of the world, but not rare in others. Sickle cell disease, for instance, is a rare disease. But if you live in northern Africa or in southern Italy, it's not all that rare. So some of it has some, geographic, but we usually talk about it globally so that they are rare. And the reason why that's important is because in terms of rare diseases, they're oftentimes under-researched, obviously, because there are few people. They're underdiagnosed, as you folks will live through. You know that. And they're also undertreated. There are not that many therapies for them, again, because it's much more difficult when you have small numbers. But as a whole entity, they really are a lot of commonalities. And that's why we talk about it internationally, globally, it's talked about as a public health issue. Public health issue because, number one, there are lots of people that are affected with rare diseases. Number two is that many of the ways in which you would deal with a rare disease, even though they're different diseases, you can deal with them similarly, right? So, you would think about that easily if you think about acromegaly, Cushing's, and other pituitary diseases, the same specialists, many of the same treatments that are available, the same ways in which we talk about trying to understand the diagnosis, but even beyond that, across many rare diseases, genetic screening, for instance. We can actually do screening, neonatals, for instance, identify with a genetic test, small drop of blood, you can identify up to about 60 rare diseases. You can actually, in the US, some of the tests go up to about 80 rare diseases. So you can identify a child at birth if they have a certain kind of genetic disease that you can pick up. One drop of blood, you can identify all of them at once. In Canada, we don't do such a great job of it. It varies across the country. In Quebec, you only test for 6 of them. In Ontario, you test for 32 of them. Saskatchewan, you test for 33 of them. So depending on where you live, you may or may not get that disease identified. But it's the common test. It's one test. One of our goals as a national policy is to try to have a standard across the country. Why does it make sense that if you happen to live in Quebec, you're going to have fewer tests and might not get identified if you happen to live in Ontario, for instance. So this is one of the challenges. The same with screening, the same with centers of excellence. In fact, we don't have to have, and you can imagine, right? You don't really have to have a center of excellence in every single province for every single disease. It just would be impractical. Not only would it be impractical, it actually would be less than excellent. Because in order to be excellent, you actually have to see a certain number of cases, right? And if you only see, a handful of cases, you're never going to be excellent at it. So the whole idea is that you need to have centers that can cover a big enough region. And in Canada, some places, you may only need 2 or 3. I mean, you think about how many pituitary centers of excellence do we need in Canada? We don't really need 13 of them, We certainly don't need, but we might need more than 1 or 2 of them because it's a big country, it's hard for people to get around to, et cetera. So some of it's practical. But what we're talking about is, at the national level, is really trying to push for centers of, it's sort of a national rare disease strategy with many different pillars. I'll talk to you a little bit more about it. I mean, we use this as a very good example, not to say we're in competition, but to recognize that rare diseases, and many of the things that we can do for rare diseases, we can do for all of rare diseases. There are more people with rare diseases directly affected with a rare disease than there are with all cancers combined, than there are with cardiovascular disease, than there are with diabetes. And yet, with each one of those others, including mental illness, there is a national strategy. There are national programs. And when you look at cardiovascular disease or cancers, think about the progress we've made in the last 20 or 30 years. The deaths that are due to cancers or cardiovascular disease, the huge advancements, the number of treatments there are for diabetes, and that's because they are treated and they're dealt with in a comprehensive way. Not only that, you think about a cancer center, right? I mean, BC especially, we always say, if you're gonna have cancer, go to BC. BC is the very best cancer, right? You've got comprehensive care, you get good testing, you get access to the best medicines, you have great experts here, you get social support all around it. It is a wonderful place to have cancer. And some other diseases, I'd probably go find some other place, but BC is a great place to have cancer. I mean, but that's because they treat all the cancers, right? They don't have separate, spots for, prostate cancer, breast cancer, and for, lung cancer. And many of the specialists and many of the support services overlap them. So that's the whole idea. Can we think about that? So this is one of the things we've been trying. I'll give you a little bit of a sample of kind of what we're doing on the rare disease strategy and where we are a little bit. Well, before I get there, I want to come back to the whole idea of treatments, though. I mean, this is kind of how we look at what's happening in terms of, certainly in terms of innovative therapies. I think Deanna was just talking about pituitary transplants, which, she's right. 5 years ago, people would have, laughed at the whole idea, right? But you think about the advances that are being made today. I mean, we just saw in the paper today, they were actually able to grow a 2-week-old embryo outside of the womb. I mean, it's a scary, thought, but the things that we can now do with technology that we couldn't do a short while ago, the kinds of drugs that we've got now that we didn't have, this is the promise in terms of innovative therapies. I mean, we have now, for instance, the first licensed gene therapy in the world. It was actually, the clinical trials were done mostly in Canada, in Quebec, where they actually take, and modify your gene. They insert a good gene into the body. They insert it through a virus. The virus takes over the bad gene, and the person is cured. Kind of amazing, right? And so when you think about it, I mean, this has been the promise. It's been out there for a long time. It's not. We've got wonderful research in blindness, for instance. One of the doctors, Dr. McDonald, who was at our conference 2 years ago, working on a therapy for a progressive form of blindness, where they actually inject a gene. I mean, it's kind of gross. You inject it into the eyeball, and everybody swears that the eyeball has no feeling, so it doesn't really matter, but just the thought of it is kind of creepy. But anyway, but it actually will halt the blindness. I mean, these are the kind of advances that are taking place everywhere. And, this is the hope, right, in terms of research. And a lot of that research is actually being done in rare diseases. So this is exciting as well, because rare diseases are a nice proving ground, for many other more common diseases. So this is important to know. As we learn about rare diseases, we're also learning about how more common diseases may function. And the therapies that are actually being developed sometimes can be very, very powerful for a much larger group of people. The problem is getting access to them, as you know. It's one thing to have the therapies, it's another thing to have them available to people. And in Canada, we have huge challenges around getting access to the therapies even after they have been approved, even after they have been reimbursed in the rest of the world. Canada has made it very challenging for patients to get access. And that's one of the reasons why, again, we're working so hard in terms of having what we call an orphan drug framework, having a rare disease reimbursement program. One of the problems we have is a whole notion around how do drugs get approved in Canada. I mean, most of you will know that there are private drug plans and there are public drug plans, right? Most of you may know is that under Health Canada, the drugs are approved to make sure that you go through the clinical trials, are the drugs safe, which is number one, so we can't, we don't want to kill anybody. And number two, do they work? But after that, the third question that's asked is, are they worth the amount of money that's being asked for them? Are they cost effective? And the ways in which we analyze whether they're cost effective are actually a lot more subjective and very much more challenging than just to know whether they're safe and effective. And that's where, in fact, in Canada, we have a huge problem because oftentimes these drugs can be quite expensive. Now, Sandostatin is very cheap because it's been around forever now, right? But your newer drugs, as they come in, are actually going to become much more expensive. And the challenge becomes, how do you decide whether or not you really want to invest in a newer therapy when you look at the added benefit of it and the added cost to it? I mean, that's the exact question that's asked. I have a new therapy. It's going to give me better benefits. On the other hand, it's going to cost more. Do I want to pay that much more for a therapy that's going to provide that much better? If you're the patient, you say, of course you do, because you want every single bit of advantage that you can get. Or you may know that the older therapy isn't going to do the same job for you. If you're the payer, you might say, let me think about it. Is it worth it? And if it's a rare disease drug, oftentimes the cost for a new therapy may be much more than the cost of an old therapy, especially if the old therapy is an old generic therapy like the Sandostatins. Long time in the market now. The ability to make it is actually quite easy. The pricing of it is based on very, very old technology, and then you introduce a new therapy. It's going to have just gone through all the research. It will have a lot of challenges in terms of the recoupment in terms of cost. It's going to come in at a very different price. So what do you do here? So this is the challenge that we have. And oftentimes in Canada, they say no. The other thing is that Canada is one of the few developed countries that doesn't have what we call an orphan drug framework, or orphan drug policy, or orphan drug legislation, whatever you call it. We do not necessarily understand the benefits of having a unique stream for orphans. Everybody understands why you want to treat cancer differently. Nobody would say, oh, geez, we should just take care of cancers in the same ordinary clinics that we do other kinds of conditions. Cardiovascular disease, nobody would ever think, okay, you got a general surgeon, they can do everything for you. We recognize that. We have not kind of made that same recognition in terms of rare diseases. So I think this is one of the challenges that we've got. So in Canada, many cases, and I won't go belabor this, when the drugs came in for a rare disease, even when they come in, a lot of times they are denied. You can see the listing here. This is the Common Drug Review. Some of you may have heard of it. This is the drug review program. After the drug is approved by Health Canada to say it's safe and it works, it goes to another body that says, is it worth the amount of money you're asking? Are the added benefits of it worth the amount that you're asking? It's like buying a new model car, right? It's like buying a hybrid as opposed to an old car. We all know, I don't know how many of you have a hybrid. We bought a hybrid. The cost differential between a hybrid and an older car is actually quite large when you think about it. For the amount of money you're going to save in gas, you're not going to recoup it in the extra amount you paid in the hybrid, right? You're buying it for some other reasons. But if you were to ask yourself, am I going to save enough in gas monies to actually offset the cost of the hybrid? You never buy the hybrid. The same with an electric car, right? The cost of these electric cars are going to be humongous. And if you had to ask yourself, am I going to save enough in terms of my gas cost to offset the cost of electricity? Actually, electricity is going to be on. Would you ever buy the electric car? It was even like the first car, right? The horse and buggy was a whole lot cheaper than the first car was. Think about it. The cost of technology is huge. relative to what the old technology would have been. This is our challenge with rare disease drugs, coupled with the fact that rare disease drugs on an individual basis tend to be very expensive. Why? Why would drugs for rare diseases be so much more expensive than a drug for a common disease? If I have a new drug for diabetes or a new drug for hypertension, why is the drug for the rare disease so much more expensive? Even if they were made with the same technology, why am I going to be charging so much more? I mean, it's easy, right? Number of people, right? If I can resell my drug and I can sell it to 30 million people versus selling my drug to 3,000 people, but it costs me the same amount to develop it, guess what? That's going to be a higher individual cost. Unfortunately, drug plans tend to look at what does it cost per person in terms of the new therapy. And oftentimes you end up with this kind of recommendation. DNL means do not list. Do not list, do not list, do not list, do not list. List with conditions. Do not list, do not list. These are drugs that are in there for rare diseases. Over and over again, we get do not list, do not list, do not list. I actually wonder why companies like Pfizer continue to bring these drugs into the country. I mean, this is a huge challenge. And it's not because the drugs don't work. It's not because the drugs are not actually worth it. It's because the way in which we assess is exactly what we just talked about in terms of how you assess the added value of a hybrid versus your old car. You're looking at what it's going to cost versus how much money I'm going to save versus what are the added advantages of it. You're not thinking about the fact that I'm investing in new technology, and if we don't invest in a new technology, we will never get out of our huge dependency just on gas-powered cars. But that's the challenge that we've got here. So this is the case. What we do know is that in most cases, we do end up with the drugs, but it's only, first of all, only about 60% of drugs for rare diseases actually get to Canada. Deanna, you know this. So, drugs for acromegaly, they don't even here sometimes. They just don't even show up in Canada because we don't have a policy for rare disease drugs. It's very hard to get reimbursements. It's small patient populations. I oftentimes go to conferences. We chase companies down and beg them to bring the drugs up. Sometimes when they come up, it's up to 6 years later. So especially for conditions that are progressive, you can imagine if there were a drug out there, we'd say, okay, here it is. But guess what? You're going to be in line for 6 years before it's going to come to Canada. This is our challenge. Or when it does come, the listing, you see this comment here, list with conditions? List with conditions means I'm going to make it available, but I'm going to decide what patient population is going to get access to it. And it's sometimes very, very narrow. In many cases, it may be a better drug, but what they will say, you've heard it, those of you who know about the arthritis drugs, et cetera, they will say it's only for people who have failed on the older drugs. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, unless the disease is very progressive and the newer drug will actually help you halt the disease. Or if there's really bad side effects to the older drugs, why do I need to make you go on the older drug and fail it, that is, have bad side effects, or show that your disease is progressing on the older drugs before I give you access to a newer drug? That's what we've got here. So it's a huge challenge. It's true for all diseases, all drugs. It's especially the case in rare diseases, and this is kind of what we want. So one of the things CORD does is we've been working on an orphan drug policy for a long time. We've been working with the provinces to try to change the ways in which they reimburse drugs. I'll tell you something that's really scarier is that right now the private drug plans are doing the same thing. Used to be in Canada. How many of you have a private drug plan? A few people do it. It used to be if you had a private drug plan, drug comes onto the market, you got a private drug plan, your doctor writes a prescription, Bob's your uncle, you got the prescription, right? More and more, the private drug plans are saying, no way. BC Teachers Federation was one of the first to say, we're going to give you exactly the same benefits as the public drug plan. Kind of makes you scratch your head as to why you're having a private drug plan then. But this is the challenge. More and more they're putting restrictions on. More and more, Manulife has now said for expensive drugs, for certain categories of drugs, we're going to wait until the public drug plan actually provides a decision before we actually list them. So this is the challenge that we're having, is that we're seeing some real changes in terms of, we understand there's more and more drugs coming on. We understand that drugs are expensive. But what we also need to make sure that everybody understands is that the reason we've got more drugs and the reason we want them is because this is the best way in which we can actually treat most diseases now. and in fact, the drug's actually safe in terms of other kinds of. So this is our problem. So one of the things we have been pushing for is working on an orphan drug policy. We've been working on a federal provincial plan for funding for rare diseases. Some of you will know is that in January of this year, the health ministers met here in Vancouver, and one of the items on their agenda was actually discussing the drugs for rare diseases. We brought a contingency of patients out here. We hosted an economic forum. We kind of marched up to the hotel where they were all staying to try to, make sort of some kind of a manifestation in front of the ministers. We almost got thrown out of the. Did you get thrown out? You didn't stick around long enough. We managed to do it. Okay, you got escorted. I know. We were just there patiently waiting for the ministers come out of their press conference. We're hanging out, right? Exactly. There were lots of. Exactly. So we were there waiting in front of the ministers to just be able to respectfully show them that we're there, we're eager to, we weren't disrupting anything, we weren't doing anything, and they tried to throw us out to say, you can't wait here. You didn't stay for the last. The last bit of it was priceless because we're all hanging out there. The health ministers are inside having a press conference. We're waiting. We saw them as they all walked in, so we all waved to them. Yeah, the security guards came over and said, you have to leave. And they sort of came up to me especially and said, so everybody says, like, who's the head here? And they pointed to me and so like, okay, that's great. And with this humongous security guard. This guy was huge. He was as big as Peter here. He was big. Yeah, this guy was, he was huge. I know. So we kind of hung around for a while. We kind of moved real slowly. And there were the medical association was there, the pharmacist association was there, the nurses group was there. We said, how come they're not being asked to leave? They said, okay, we're moving everybody out. So they moved everybody else out. We're moving slowly. At the last minute, we're kind of moving towards the elevator, right? The health minister's press conference broke up. The health ministers came out, and they all came over to say hello to us. They came over to say hello to us. They shook our hands. They took pictures with us. They were kind of like, what's the fuss here? We explained to them. They were trying to throw us out, and they're all going like, what? What are they doing here? Why are they throwing you out? We said, da-da-da-da-da. The next day, they called me up, and they said, okay, we're going to give you passes so you can actually go inside the press conference. It was amazing. The security guard came up the next day to us, and he says, if there's anything I can do for you, just let me know. We said yes. So it was kind of interesting, But, I mean, it was interesting. I mean, what we were pushing for and what they've been promising is to have some kind of a national program for drugs for rare diseases. It's been a long time coming. They first promised this in 2006 at the time when Minister Dosanjh, remember Dosanjh? Who was the health minister? He was the one that made the promise, like in 2006. So we've been we tried to come back again and said, it's been like 10 years since this was first made. So we're hoping that there will, in fact, be something that's tabled this year. We're not terribly optimistic in terms of what it might say, though, because, number one, nephew may be interested in it, they're still calling this expensive drugs for rare diseases. I sort of asked him, I said, why do you call it expensive drugs for rare diseases? Why can't you just call it drugs for rare diseases program? He says, Dirhan, if they weren't expensive, we wouldn't be having these discussions. If they were cheap, we would just fund them. And I kind of say, okay, I get it. We understand that. This is not just a unique to Canada problem. Everybody has the challenge. How do you fund these drugs? How do you make them available to people? And it's not just, I mean, to be honest, it isn't just that they're expensive. It is the case in many, many of these drugs is that we have a lot of what they call uncertainty about how safe they are and how well they work. And let me kind of give you a quick snapshot as to why that's the case so that you don't get kind of blindsided with these arguments. You think about a new drug for acromegaly. Okay, so there's going to be a new drug made available. Most drugs, when we're thinking about them, let's say for diabetes, how many patients do you put into a clinical trial? You would have a minimum of 600 cardiovascular drugs just coming out, 2,000 patients in them, right? And it means if I put 2,000 patients into the clinical trials, and on balance, it's safe, and on balance, patients get better than not, right? I'm pretty confident that this drug actually is safe and works. I've had 2,000 people in the clinical trials, right? How many people am I going to put in an acromegaly trial? Yeah, right. I'm not going to scrape up 2,000 people, right? It's not going to happen. I may have 200 people if I'm really lucky. With some of these rare diseases, I'm going to be lucky if I get 60 people in it. So I got 60 people that are in this clinical trial. And I say and as you know, not everything works for everybody, right? No drug works for everybody, even for, all the diabetes patients. But fair number. So if 1,500 people get better and 500 people don't, I'm pretty confident it works. But let's say I only have 60 people in a drug trial. And let's say 35 of them get better and 25 don't. Does this drug work or not? I'm not real sure, right? Even if 40 of them got better and 20 of them didn't, does it really work? I'm not real sure. So that's the challenge we've got. We have a higher level of uncertainty in terms of what that clinical trial tells us, right? And, in fact, because, you all know that yourselves. Acromegaly in one person looks nothing like acromegaly in another person. And what's going to work for Connie is not necessarily going to work for Deanna, it's not going to necessarily work for Peter in the same way. I got you people, you're kind of like all over the place in terms of how this drug works, right? So I can do a clinical trial, and I will see a whole lot of variation in terms of how well it works. Now, if I got 1,500 people, on average, it kind of balances out, right? But if I only got a small handful of people, I'm not quite sure exactly who it's going to work for.
Can I just make a comment on that, too?
Absolutely.
For clinical trials, they want people between certain ages. And, so with the age groups that we have even here, how would that play?
Well, you're absolutely right. You don't get pristine populations, right? Well, I do not get people that have not gotten other treatments before. Usually, right, we want to get, you see the ads, right? We like to get somebody who hasn't had exposure to other treatments. Well, that's not going to really happen. We like to get people who are all at about the same stages in terms of their disease and have no comorbidities, right? Well, that ain't going to happen. You guys have all kinds of things. They're all over the place, right? So, again, as you say, if the drug doesn't work in you, I don't know it's because of your stage of acromegaly. I don't know it's because you got some other kinds of conditions that are also now part of it, whether you've got diabetes or you have other kinds. We don't know, right? And we're not, or your age. And we're not going to be able to get, that kind of pristine population. So it doesn't mean we can't do the clinical trials. It doesn't mean that we can't have some answers. It just means that we're not sure. And what you get the reimburser saying, I don't want to pay for uncertainty. I don't want to pay for the drug. I'm not going to give it to all of you here because I don't know who it's going to work for. I can do it in diabetes because that's fine. Some of you it will work for, and some of you it won't work for. And on average, as we know, even in chemotherapy, right? Maybe 40% of the time it doesn't really work. But it doesn't really matter that much because I have enough people that on average it's going to kind of do better than not. And as long as nobody, what we have is, in rare diseases, we have to take different strategies. And it's not to say we can't do it. We just have to do it differently. It means that we take small clinical trials. It means that we monitor the patients much more intensely. It means that we actually track the patients after the clinical trials are over. It means that when we bring patients on, we bring them on really believing that, okay, I'm going to need to monitor you. And if it works, you stay on the therapy. If it doesn't work, I take you off the therapy. It really, and that's going to happen anyway. None of your physicians are going to put you on a therapy and say, okay, can you come back in a year? It's not going to happen. You're going to be monitored. You're going to have regular blood work, and you know that already. You're going to get the follow-up. And if it isn't working, then we're going to have to look at something else. That's the way in which we're working on this. So there's lots of strategies for it. The challenge is that we haven't evolved those systems because we have developed most of our systems for these larger common conditions. Does that make sense? That's exactly it. I mean, there are lots of ways in which we are used to doing research, but in fact, it doesn't work very well for rare diseases. Most other countries have actually evolved to that. In Canada, we're still working on it. Let me finish the strategy. So what we did do was introduce a strategy. And what we said is that you can't just have a drug, you need to have a comprehensive, like you have comprehensive cancer clinics, like you have comprehensive cardiovascular clinics, comprehensive diabetes, right? We don't just hand people insulin. We actually do a lot of other kinds of work. We don't just give people chemotherapy. You actually have to do a lot of work around the cancer. So we need to do that for rare diseases. And you can actually have a common strategy. Improving early detection and prevention. This has a lot of commonalities. It doesn't matter which rare disease it is. One of the goals, right, is to be able to have a diagnosis early and to be able to introduce treatment. I mean, and part of that is genetic testing, obviously. We talk, in terms of genomic testing, genomic sequencing is actually becoming cheaper and cheaper, where you can actually map the genome, find out exactly what part of it is defective and causing the disease, and begin to actually diagnose people on the basis of their genetic material. We're doing that right now in some of the common diseases, right? Think about breast cancer, you think about lung cancer. We actually can identify in a large population of breast cancer patients different subgroups, and we can target the medicines to them. Well, this is kind of like rare diseases all over. We can identify small populations that have specifically, genomic defects, and we can then identify that disease based on their genomic testing. Used to be it cost about $100,000 to do a genomic testing, and it took about 200 hours. It's now come down to about $1,000, and it takes maybe 10 hours. We're getting it actually down to, they figure in the next 5 years it'll be down to $200 a person. So, I mean, it's quite reasonable. You still need to interpret it, so that includes interpretation, but it's actually quite doable. And that is a very common strategy that one can think about for all rare diseases. The other thing we can do, and which we don't do well enough, and you folks know this better than anybody else, we could actually do a better job of diagnosis if your clinicians are attuned to what some of the signs and symptoms are. I mean, Connie did a brilliant presentation here. I mean, hers was gradual, so, it's really hard unless you're tracking her. But you think about it, right? I mean, how many of you would say, once you got a diagnosis, oh yeah, if I think back, 5 years, if I think back 10 years, we kind of could have known that, right? Because there were a lot of signs and symptoms even back then. Nobody picked up on it. She talked about the carpal tunnel syndrome, right? It's sort of like, yeah, we should have been able to pick up on that and to ask the question, why might you have that? If it's not something that is maybe a little different for you, because if you're a mechanic and you're using your hands, somebody might have said, okay, it's part of the work. But for somebody else, we had a woman yesterday who was a lawyer. She had surgery for carpal tunnel syndrome. It was sort of like, why on earth would she have it? I mean, she's a lawyer, for goodness sake. She's a lawyer and an academic. Nobody asked the question. So it's only after, and some of the features that you're talking about. I don't know if you remember Paula. She's in Toronto. Paula tells, it's a brilliant story. She has acromegaly. She had acromegaly. She got surgery for it. She's a nurse. She's actually totally recovered from the. It seems to be her, a total success in terms of not having any of her symptoms come back, and I think her levels are actually quite good. She tells this story. She said her mother lives in the UK. Her mother's blind. She said her mother was getting her hair washed in a beauty shop one day. It's the sink there. And she heard in the next sink a woman starting to talk about some symptoms she's gotten. And this blind mother says, oh my gosh, I think I know what you have. I think you have acromegaly. And so she encouraged the woman to go in and get tested. Sure enough, the woman got tested. She had acromegaly. We're saying, good gosh, if a blind mother can diagnose this in a beauty shop, why aren't our clinicians doing a better job for us? You know what I mean? We actually can get clinicians. And this is no fault of the clinicians, right? Because they're not really attuned to looking at abnormalities. But, I mean, it's not just for acromegaly. For so many conditions, right? We go all the way back and say, oh, yeah, if we only had, and I think of the parents. We did a survey, right, in terms of diagnosis. And what we found was that it took 2 to 12 years for a patient to get a diagnosis. They could see sometimes up to 9 specialists before they got the right specialist. Paying attention to some of the signs and symptoms in order to get to diagnosis, or even just recognizing that if the patient says, this is not right, this isn't the way it's supposed to be, if a parent says, look, I've been into emergency every other month now. This is not right. You can't just say this. To follow up on that and to try to then begin to sort out. There are all kinds of algorithms that you can use to begin to narrow down what that diagnosis is. There's some amazing websites, and they're not just common, it's not Dr. Google websites. They're just genuine medical websites that allow you to begin to identify what the diagnosis is. The more symptoms you put in, the more it starts to guess for you what it is you might have. I mean, we just need to provide not only the training to say, okay, if it's not, my daughter, know that I've got 2 kids, both of them who were born with rare diseases, and my daughter was born with, God knows what, we still don't have it, we never did ever get a diagnosis for it, and she was 2 years sort of, in a state where she had very low muscle tone, very low sort of cognitive developments, very slow in development, and you don't know what it is. I mean, that generally was the case. They couldn't find it, and they did kind of work for it. I don't know how well they worked for it, and I don't know what else they could have done. But there are many, many cases, right, in which if we start to put in all the signs and symptoms, you do begin to narrow down to what a diagnosis might be. And if we had centers of excellence where you can actually then refer the patient and send their tests, you can then begin to narrow it down even more in terms of what it might be. And then you can actually then have centers where you might send the patient in order to get a proper diagnosis. So we can do those kinds of things. I mean, this is something that can be done quite commonly. So getting early diagnosis, being able to do prevention. Second one is having, as we say, timely, equitable, and evidence-informed care, meaning centers of excellence. Good community support, and this is like for the patient communities, are a huge source of support, and yet no patient group in this country really gets any kind of funding. I mean, this is the biggest challenge, right? Not only are you trying to provide support and trying to provide awareness and you're trying to do the advocacy, you're also needing to figure out where you're going to get the monies. This is a huge, not the case everywhere in the world, to be honest with you. Sustainable access to therapies, this is one of the big parts that we're working on. How do we make sure that the drugs that coming in, we can make them available to patients in a way that's sustainable, and promoting research, having real research strategies. Some of this we're doing. I will say is that one of the exciting things that happened for us this past year was on Rare Disease Day, February the 29th. We originally were going to have a national conference. Turns out the Parliament wasn't sitting. So we went into the Ontario House and we actually hosted we asked, the province to recognize Rare Disease Day. The Minister of Health actually stood up and recognized Rare Disease Day, and he came to our press meeting afterwards, and he promised that Ontario would implement an Ontario Rare Disease Strategy, set up a working group for it. And I will say this past week we were at a meeting where we have now got co-chairs of the meetings. We've identified the patients that are going to be in it. We've identified specialists. We are working on a plan in Ontario to have a rare disease strategy. And as importantly, they said, we're not going to rewrite the strategy. We're going to use the Canadian strategy. We're going to bring it into Ontario. Pretty amazing. Now, it still has to be implemented. A lot of good political promises. We figured they got 2.5 years before the next election, so let's see if we can hold them to it. So this is actually quite interesting. And some of it will be very much implementable nationally. Centers of excellence. We're talking about how we identify not just in Ontario, but other places that have centers that we can build on. And actually, newborn screening, genome screening, that can't be just a provincial program. In order to work, you got to have it, all of these have to be national. Therapies, in terms of access to therapies, that's working on, the Pan-Canadian program. So we're hoping that, Ontario is the biggest province. He's been one of the biggest barriers, quite frankly. It has been one of the biggest barriers to getting a strategy. So we're very, very excited in terms of the opportunities. Now, we'd love to see the other provinces also stand up and do the same thing. This is Ontario. Ontario's already said, okay, we're going to start implementing. What we love to see is other provinces say, we can begin to do that, and then, of course, work together. We don't want to have 13 different strategies across the country, but we do need to have them work together. And what they've agreed to is that the Ontario strategy will actually be a building block for the rare disease strategy nationally. So this is very exciting. It was totally unexpected for us, but it was very exciting in terms of having that happen. Having a strategy actually works towards informing care. I won't go into this too much, but it is very important in terms of the first parts of it. This talks a bit about the life cycle and how we actually do this. I will just say very, very quickly, when I said, and Deanna was saying before, most of the drugs and the clinical trials are designed under an old mentality of how you actually develop drugs, and you test them, as you say, against placebo, you test them with big populations, you look at how safe they are, you look at how effective they are, and most of the times, it's a yes or a no. Yes, they're safe, yes, they work, as opposed to recognizing what many of you will know, and that is, they work sometimes, and they work for some people. and they work under some conditions. And what we need to do is identify for whom does it work, under what conditions, and how can we make them available. And this whole notion of a life cycle is really intimate to it, because what it says is that we don't have to be absolutely sure it's going to work for everybody before we make it available. So that's kind of exciting. And when we get enough evidence that it works for some people and that it's safe enough, we can begin to make it available to those people, especially if it's a progressive condition, especially if it's something that, is going to be life-saving. But we can also identify people for whom it might work, put them into what we might call an extended type of clinical trial, into a monitoring trial, monitor them, and be able to collect continuing information as to whether it works. We can reassess. 1 year later, 3 years later, 5 years later, how well does it work? I put you all in the therapy. For whom does it work? For whom doesn't it work? How well is it working? What are my risks there? And then we can come back and say, okay, let's now look at this drug again. So instead of waiting 2 years, 3 years, 6 years before we make the drug available, we can make it available in a much shorter period of time, sometimes even in less than a year, and we can begin to monitor people. We aren't going to give it to people for whom we have concerns. We aren't going to give it to people without monitoring them. But it's sort of like having a bigger clinical trial, if you think about it, right? It's sort of like enrolling people, but it's not a clinical trial. It's going to be available through, The only challenge, the big challenge is who pays for it. And part of the proposal is that we kind of have what they call risk-sharing agreements. You pay for part of it, I pay for part of it. Government pays for part of it, the drug plan pays for part of it. We share that risk. So this is the whole thing. Let me just sort of finish up by talking a bit about, so this is what we're trying to work towards. I don't know, do you want me to go into this? There's just a little spiel on patients and patient advocacy. Okay, let me talk about patient advocacy. It's my favorite topic anyway, and you guys are into advocacy. So one of the things that's really happening in terms of rare diseases right now is where it's coming in. And that is, it's coming at a time where actually patients are more important than ever in terms of healthcare. They're more central than ever. I mean, even if we aren't well included in all of the decisions, people at least recognize that we ought to be included. So we're there. They recognize that they can't exclude us. They're not doing a great job of, it's sort of like patient-centered care, right? Your physician can't just make a decision for you and say, here's what you do. They're supposed to talk to you about it. They're supposed to explain it to you. So at the individual level. Certainly at the group level, we have, when these drugs come up for review, as a patient group, you get to write a recommendation or a summary of your experiences into the drug plan to tell them what you think, and they're supposed to at least pay attention to it. So what I'm saying is that we're at a very interesting time now, because once upon a time, not that long ago, I call it in the 1980s, the whole notion of patient engagement was non-existent. Patients had no role, right? I mean, HIV, cancer, breast cancer, it kind of changed all of that. It opened up the door to say, no, wait, patients need to be included. They have a real voice. They need to be taken into consideration. So, I was saying prior to 1980, it was sort of like barbarians at the gate. We kind of kept hammering away at the gate trying to get in, but it was very hard to get your voice heard. At some point, okay, it was recognized, we get to come in, they open it up, but they still didn't kind of really treat you very well. It's kind of like, the whole notion of beggars at the table, or, the wedding crashers. They're a little bit of a strange creature there, and yes, we let you into the room, but we're really not sure what to do with you, and we're not real sure whether or not your opinion is worth a whole lot. So we're there, and we're kind of being consulted, but not really. We've kind of got to the point now where, in the last decade or so, we've got patients that sit on the committee to evaluate drugs. We've got patients that are sitting in policy meetings. We've got some of the reviewers that have been very good. And, Tanya and Dave, they now include patients in every single phase of the assessment committee. So patients are being included, and they're being trained so that when they sit at the table, many cases, when we were first invited in, you're not real sure. You're sitting in a room with a whole bunch of medical doctors, and you're sitting there with a bunch of economists, and you're trying to, have a voice heard, but you don't really know what the committee's all about, and you don't really have the confidence to actually speak up because you don't understand the whole process. So now we're getting people in who do have a role, who are understanding, and it wasn't that you're stupid, it's just that this isn't your main job, whereas these are other people's main jobs. Peter's probably going to be able to go into any committee and sit there and be an intelligent person, but if you don't know what the committee's about and you haven't been schooled in terms of, it'd be like walking into a banking committee and going like, okay, that was interesting. I have no idea what we're talking about, right? So, I mean, that's the challenge, is that we are now beginning to train up people. We're beginning to have rooms for it, and there's huge processes for it. As I said, I get to the point now where people are saying it's a little bit like the inmates are running the asylum. You know, are we kind of letting patients take over too much, or we're paying too much attention to them? It's not such a bad idea. As I always say, you know, you think about how the asylums are run, inmates couldn't do a much worse job than what's happening in many cases, so let's not get too excited about it, right? So patient groups are contributing to the change, and this is an exciting time because as we're talking about our rare disease strategy, I mean, we created Canada's rare disease strategy. The patient group led that. We brought in all of the other stakeholders, including the researchers, including the clinicians, including the policymakers, including the industry, to say, we're hosting the table. I mean, what we learned a long time ago is that when they're hosting the table, we don't get invited in. So you do what Deanna's doing. You host your own table. We have the table. We invite you to come in. Sometimes they come in, sometimes they don't, but we create the documents, we put them out there, and we continue to promote them. And we do have some that are willing to come, right? And so it's like having meetings. Some of the doctors will show up, and they're wonderful, and you get very good at knowing which doctors are going to come in and be very respectful and be able to speak to you. Fine, let's work with those. And then hopefully they will help to disseminate it. And if you come out with things that are good, people start to pay attention. So that's the whole, what we're trying to do now, is we're setting the table. We're hosting those kinds of meetings. We're inviting the stakeholders in. And there are always those that are willing to work with us. I mean, obviously we can't do anything by ourselves. We don't know anything about banking. So we need to have the real experts around the table with us, but we can host those meetings. So this is beginning to happen, and it's a wonderful opportunity. And I'd say this to end up with saying, because in terms of rare diseases, it's always been the patient groups. If I go and look at every single orphan drug rare disease policy that takes place internationally, it's been driven by the patients. In most cases, it's because nobody else was. In most cases, because patients in rare diseases are quite desperate. There's nothing else for them. If they know if they don't do it for themselves, nobody's going to do it for them. So you got to create it. It said almost every single case. I mean, prior to the 1980s, there were almost no drugs for rare diseases. People just wouldn't do it. I mean, and since then, we've seen huge numbers happen. And it's all started in the U.S. with the first Orphan Drug Act. And I say the key to the Orphan Drug Act, which has now spawned some 500 new therapies for rare diseases, is a mother, Abby Myers, who is the head of the National Organization of Rare Diseases, a congressman, Henry Waxman. Those of you who may be little political, wonks will know that he was one of the most powerful heads of the Health and Committee in the U.S. Congress. And this guy, Jack Klugman. I mean, and this is actually an interesting history of how the Orphan Drug Act, this is a true story, okay? So prior to 1983, only 10 new drugs for rare diseases. And in most cases, because it cost too much to develop them, and the companies just didn't want to bother. They're called, you know why they're called orphan drugs? It's not the diseases that are orphan, it was the drugs that were orphan. Because when companies got a drug, and they started to develop it, if it didn't have a large patient population, they'd put it on a shelf. They would orphan that drug. What happened was that Abby Myers had a son with Tourette syndrome. He was in a clinical trial for a drug, Tourette's. Now, the drug was not for Tourette syndrome. The drug was actually for a bigger condition. But Tourette's was a small group that they said, let's try it out with them anyway, include them into it. The bigger disease, as they were working with it, turns out was not going to work. This is Johnson & Johnson, and it's sort of known history. And they said, we're just going to stop the clinical trials on this drug. It's not working for our population, for the patients, the groups that we've gotten there. And so we're also going to stop it for Tourette's. And Abby says, you can't do that. My son's on this drug. This drug isn't working for him. You can't stop the clinical trials. They said, well, we don't want to do it just for Tourette's. It's not a big enough patient population. And even if we actually got the drug successful, we would never be able to make enough money to make it worthwhile. So we're going to quit the clinical trials. And that was the history of what happened with rare disease drugs. Nobody really wanted to develop them. There was no market for them. There was no profit to be made into them. So she wrote a letter in the National Organization for Rare Disorders. A mother in California saw that same thing. She says, my son's on that same clinical trial. So she writes to Abby and says, what do we do? Abby says, write to your congressman. Well, her congressman happened to be Henry Waxman. So she wrote to Henry Waxman. Now, Henry had been for the last 3 years trying to get a bill in for orphan drugs in the House. And he says, great opportunity. Let's have hearings in the Congress. So they held hearings to invite people to come in. Not a single manufacturer showed up. None of the companies showed up. And so Waxman was a little bit concerned about that. But Jack Klugman's brother saw this and said, oh my gosh, we should be able to get patients in. So he said, he said, Kluckman's doing a radio show. Invited patient to go in, talk on Kluckman show. Kluckman says, we should actually host a demonstration in front of Washington. Bring the patients down. So he said to Abby, can you get your patients to come in and we'll host a demonstration in front of the White House before the next set of hearings to raise awareness. And Abby says, are you nuts? He says, this is February. It is freezing cold down there. Many of my patients are on crutches. They're in wheelchairs. I can't host a demonstration in front of the White House in the middle of February. Kluckman says, no problem. He says, we have a street in Pasadena. It looks just like Washington, D.C. We'll fly them all in there. We'll film it there, and we'll just say it's Washington, which is exactly what they did. And they held it. And they held the next set of hearings, and the company showed up. And that was the beginning of the Orphan Drug Act. Same thing in Taiwan. This is one of my favorite groups of people, one of the best patient organizations in rare disease patient organizations, started by a mother and a father, two very different rare diseases. They both had kids with rare diseases, and they basically said, what are we going to do? And they have developed a huge patient organization in Taiwan that now has about 54 staff people. They have about 13 offices right across Taiwan. They have a most amazing rare disease policy in Taiwan, probably the best going. Same thing in terms of Japan, the Japan Patient Association, very, very isolated, very different, but we love the way they've been able to start off with a very isolated, circumscribed set of diseases and being able to spawn it into a huge patient organization, but also have one of the best, orphan drug rare disease programs that are in the world today. Almost every single case, I go around the world. Reuters, European organization, Colombia, a wonderful colleague who's in Colombia. I mean, every single one. She's a mother. She had a child who actually died when she was 12 years old. She's kind of taken this up with a passion. They've got Colombia right now is doing an epidemiological study on rare diseases. They're trying to identify how many patients, what are the most common rare diseases, how many patients are in each one of this. They've got the government actually doing the study. They also have a policy that says every single health service that is going to come before the Colombia government has to have a patient engagement in it. We have to have patients on there. Very interesting. I mean, a lot of it still is in the works and implementation, but this is all driven by patients and a lot of by rare disease patients. So as I say, 5 universal truths about advocacy, no matter where you live, advocacy matters. It really is. Patients speaking up have really made the difference in and you know that, right? I mean, HIV and breast cancer were sort of those beginning examples, but rare diseases is stepping up to being the most powerful advocacy community in the world. And you look at what's happening, you look at the changes that are they're happening not just for rare diseases. The benefits are right across the spectrum in terms of patients taking on the role of actually developing drugs, writing guidances for the government, developing their own instruments in terms of how to measure the benefits of it. Muscular dystrophy basically said the instrument that measures whether this drug works or not is an instrument that we don't have any understanding of. It doesn't work. And one of the things they have is this thing called a 5-minute walk test. How far can a patient walk in 5 minutes? And does the drug help them so that they can actually walk further or faster in 5 minutes? Muscular dystrophy says this is a progressive disease. These boys are going to deteriorate. They're not going to walk faster. I cannot use that as a benchmark to say whether or not this drug works. We need something else. Pretty powerful, right? I mean, it's true. I mean, that is the standard in terms of whether or not a drug helps to improve neuromuscular disorders. And they said that's a useless test for us. So they came up with a whole new standard. So this is this kind of stuff that patients are actually pushing for and being able to happen. Creating, cystic fibrosis, the little 14-year-old girl. I mean, that drug was actually funded by the patient community. They raised the funds. They hired the researchers. They commissioned that research. They said, we can't wait. We're going to do it ourselves. So this is what we're talking about. And then when it came to market, nobody wanted to pay for it, but that's a different story. That's why the little 14-year-old girl was there. So all of this is to say, successful advocacy, though, really does involve real people taking part. And I'll end up by saying this. This is kind of how I see advocacy working. It always, always starts with patient stories. So the stories that Connie tells, the stories that Deanna tells, the story each one of you tells. Every single advocacy campaign starts with that story. We're going to be testifying in front of the Health Standing Committee on a national pharmacare strategy. We start our testimony with 4 patient stories. They hear all kinds of stuff from other people. They understand all the rules and they got all the legal gobbledygook. What they need to hear and understand is how does this affect patients? Who are the people, right? You know how many cases there are in which once you got somebody to understand the people that are involved, things change. So we need them to understand. Who are the people involved? But as we also know, individual stories don't really change policy. They may get somebody to solve that particular problem. That's why you have to have groups like you do here. I mean, as you know, you can't go to the parliament and say, can you do an acromegaly day? Because me, Deanna, I like it. I want you to do that. But if you have a whole group around you, and if you have a bigger pituitary group says, we need to do it, they begin to listen, right? So you need to have that. Even more importantly is if you have people on the inside. And as you know, you gotta have, who are the other people in the house that can actually stand up with you? I mean, we made the case for the rare disease strategy, but was the clinician standing up and our getting to the minister who stood up and says, we can do that. I mean, you gotta have people on the inside. You can't, I always say, you can be as strong and as tough as you want outside, but if you can't get inside the door and sit down at the table, nothing happens. I gotta get inside, I gotta be at the table. But when you get to the table, you gotta know how to behave yourself. This is very important, okay? Yeah, we need a little bit of training. And as we say, some of the best people outside are not the people you want at the table. You gotta make sure that, no, you know what I mean though. When you come to the table, it's a different story. And then once you're really good though, you get to be part of the coalition. Once you get to be part of the groups, once you get to be part of what you're doing, of the rules that are being made, the working group that the minister set up, the most important thing on it is that we're gonna have 4 patients on it. I mean, that's critical. Because then you're helping to design and develop those policies that make sense. We asked for the patient group to be the co-chair, and they kind of said, not in this lifetime. But at least we're on the committee. So that's, but that's what we want, right? I'll end with this picture, and I really hate to put it up there because Peter's going to stand up and tell you something totally different. This is the best we could do. We actually took a group of patients on a trek into the Arctic Circle. And people were asking us, about what's a rare disease patient? I think they were looking for people with 2 heads or something. We're trying to explain to people. They just look like, most of the time, they look like ordinary people, and they're just like people like you and me. We actually did a trek into the Arctic Circle, and took about 5 days, and really was quite a lovely trek. The youngest little boy there is 8 years old, and I have a grandfather there who's 72 years old. So it was a wonderful trip, and we kind of thought we'd do it again, but maybe after listening to Peter, we've got some better things that we might try to do instead, some bigger ambitions. But this was our trek into it. So thank you very much.